We've got Joe Sikowitz from Fenway Library Organization doing Making Slips Your Own. Take it away.
Okay, thank you, Lizette. My name is Joe Sikowitz, and I am going to be talking about making slips your own using basic HTML, CSS, and the template toolkit to make dynamic notices and slips in Koha. I am the Systems and Support Manager at the Fenway Library Organization, which is a consortium based out of Boston for several academic libraries, but we also work with many other academic libraries throughout Massachusetts. One takeaway from this presentation, I hope, is that you don't need to be very skilled in HTML, CSS, or template toolkit to do what I did in the main example that I'm going to show here. And if you do have skills in these areas, you may be able to do something fancier than what I did. So hopefully this will be a good introduction to get you started if you're interested in doing anything like this. Okay. So a little bit of background about this project. So as I said, I work for Flow, but I also work with a consortium called the Higher Education Libraries of Massachusetts, which is supported by Flow. It's a network of 12 colleges in Massachusetts. 11 of them are community colleges. One is a four-year college. However, they have fairly similar needs. So when we came up with this solution, we were able to adapt it for all of them. They've been Koha users since the network was founded in 2017, so about 3 to 4 years. And Flow, as I mentioned, provides library support, and we also host their catalog. And then one interesting thing about HELM is it's highly collaborative. The entire network is managed through a highly collaborative approach, and this project really wasn't done any differently. And I'll just mention that I worked closely with a colleague, Kim Robbins at Middlesex, on this to develop this process. So it's an iterative process where Kim and I went back and forth to get it just right. Okay, so what is the problem that we were trying to solve here? So the problem we found was that we needed different slips and notices for different circumstances. And specifically, the example we're going to look at today, HELM needed 3 different types of hold slips depending on where the item was going to go. The first one was an internal hold slip, so that was for items that were remaining at the library. We also needed slips for ComCat, and ComCat stands for Commonwealth Catalog. That is a statewide, more or less ILL service, and so we needed slips indicating that items were going to go to ComCat for those requests. And then we also needed in-network slips, so within HELM, they were going to non-Middlesex or non-originating branch libraries, and they also had to mimic the statewide delivery form, and that's a very specific form that I'm going to show you in a few minutes, and they require that the slip looks exactly like the form that they have. So that was one challenge that we had to overcome. So what was our solution? It was to use basic, and I want to emphasize basic, HTML, CSS, and the template toolkit to create customized solutions for each of these 3 scenarios. Specifically, the logic that template toolkit, and I will abbreviate it in my presentation as TT, the logic that TT provides allows for different slips or notices, if you're making notices, to be triggered depending on where the hold is supposed to go. So in our case, we were looking at holds, but it could be for other variables or other factors. And the HTML and CSS we used were for some basic formatting, and then the template toolkit was basically just used to determine where or which slip to print out. And we're going to go in depth on how we did that. So here is the hold slip pop up, and this is the statewide delivery form that was required in order to circulate these to our statewide delivery service within the HELM network. So this is what we had to produce or wanted to produce automatically if an item was going to another HELM library that wasn't the originating branch. So looking at this form, the things that are generated from koha variables are the region code and region at the top. So the N, Northeast region in this example. Middlesex Community College Library, Bedford, that is generated as well. And then the date line is generated from koha as well. Everything else is coded into the template with HTML and CSS. So that's how we get the formatting and the language that appears outside of those three variables. And I'm going to talk about this more in depth as well. So this is the most complicated piece that we had to produce. The other pieces, as you'll see, were more or less notes that we were just asking it to produce. Okay, so before I get into the mechanics of what we specifically did, I just wanted to present a few other possible applications if you are interested in doing something like this, just to get your brain thinking about other applications of these tools. So one is that you could send different overdue notices to different patron groups, potentially. So if you had one notice that you wanted to send to adults, or one notice you wanted to send to children at your library, you could do that. In the academic setting, you could send one notice to students and one to faculty. Another example is you could use item type to send one notice for books, another one for laptops potentially, or other technology. And then what we did is we printed different hold slips based on the destination. So you could print one hold slip for network holds and another for ILL. And really there are, I wouldn't say an infinite number of combinations that you can dream up, but there are many, many more combinations you could come up with and potentially use for, or with these tools. Okay, so now I'm going to break the process down piece by piece so you can see what we did. And then finally, we'll build up to the final product, and you can hopefully see how all of these pieces interact to allow us to do this. And then I will show a brief demo in our test system that shows you it actually working. So first up is HTML. So we actually only used very few HTML tags. In this example, I'm just showing an H2 tag, which is a heading tag in HTML. All HTML goes between the two tags, so there's an opening and a closing tag. In this example, there's the H2 opening tag and then the H2 closing tag with the slash in it. Basically, the HTML tags each control the formatting of text. And then in this example, H2 is a heading tag, so that comes with some formatting and font weight automatically added to it. And then we also did use some CSS, which allows you to do a little bit more complex formatting. And in this example below, under HTML and CSS, there's a div tag. So you can see the div at the beginning, and then the closing div tag at the end. And then everything after the style in the quotation marks is our CSS. And I'll provide some resources at the end of this if you want to look at the different HTML and CSS tags you can use. But the point here is that you can really control the formatting more using the CSS. So here, I'm changing the border at the top. I'm changing it to a solid line and making it black. I'm also aligning the text in the center. I'm adding padding, which just means spacing to the top. And I'm changing the weight of the font to bold here as well. So you can do all of those things just using CSS inside of that style attribute. Now the town/institution, that's just the text that I'm asking it to display within that HTML tag, just like I'm doing it above in the H2 example. Okay, so one other piece that was important to this project were HTML tables. And HTML tables have essentially three elements. So there's the table tag. So you can see in this example, and I've marked it here. It's just table inside the two angle brackets, and then a slash table at the end of your table. And then within your table, you have rows and you have cells. So in my example at the top, I have one row. It's the TR, and again, that has opening and closing tags. I have one cell, that's the TD, again, opening and closing tags. And then I have some more HTML inside, the div tag, like I used before in my last example. And then within that is a koha variable. So if you're familiar at all with the koha notices and slips, the koha variables come in the double angle bracket. So in this example, I am using the branches.branchAddress3 variable from the notices. And you can use these all throughout your notices and slips, whether you're using Template Toolkit or not, whether you're using HTML or not, you can always use the koha provided variables. And then here at the bottom, just to make how tables work even clearer, I am providing a visual example. So the entire table is enclosed by our table tag. And then each row is a TR, a table row tag. And then each cell is a TD tag. And you can have as many TD tags within a row as you would like. And each one is a separate cell of data or information that you're providing. So using those HTML tools, the tables, and then a few tags, mostly headings and divs, that's all the HTML that I've used. I did use a bit of CSS, as you can see, but it's more or less just some basic formatting. Okay, so getting now into Template Toolkit, this is available in all koha notices and slips, so you can do this for any notice you'd like. In this example, we did it in a slip. And according to the manual, it's a fast, flexible, and highly extensible template processing system. So it allows you to essentially use a template, but with different results depending on the circumstances. One important thing to know about Template Toolkit is that all directives are between the square bracket and %sign tags. So just like HTML has the angle bracket tags, all Template Toolkit tags have this format. So Template Toolkit allows for a lot of the features of a programming language like conditions, variables, loops, and more. However, in my example, and you may be able to do this if you're interested in doing it yourself, you really don't need most of that. And in the example I'm going to show, I only use conditions, and I actually only use one variable. So just using conditions and variables, you can produce different slips or different notices based on the data. There is a Template Toolkit manual, which is highly detailed and provides a lot of information. Again, you may not need the entire thing to do what I'm doing here, but it is freely available on the internet, and I'll provide a link at the end as well to take a look at that. The Koha Wiki is a good source for the available variables by notice and slip. So again, I'll provide that link again at the end of this presentation, but that is my primary source to see which variables are available to Template Toolkit in the different notices and slips. And then the final thing I'd like to emphasize with Template Toolkit is that experimentation is key. As I mentioned at the beginning of this was an iterative process that I went through with a colleague of mine, testing it over and over again to make sure we were getting the correct results. So we didn't get it the first time or the second time we tried it. We just had to keep trying different things. I also built up from simple examples to more complex, a more complex system that eventually did work. Okay, so here is a simple example of Template Toolkit in action, similar to what we use in our notices. So the first thing to notice or to note here are the tags. So as I mentioned on the last slide, our Template Toolkit is in the square bracket %sign tag. Next is our if statement. The if is just saying check this condition, and it checks to see if it's true or false. That's it. is this condition true or false? After that is what we're checking. So we are checking a variable, and as I mentioned, these variables are available from that Koha wiki page. So we're checking to look at the hold branch code, and what we're trying to see if is true is the hold.branch code variable equal to the branch, in this case Middlesex Bedford, so that's our branch code MCCB. If it is true, produce the result below. And the result below is just the HTML and text that I'm asking it to print. So in this case, the P tag with some text. And then finally, all template toolkit directives are finished with an end statement. So in this example, again, we have the square brackets with a %sign, and we have the end command. And so just to sum it up, this simple example just says, if the hold was placed for the Middlesex Bedford branch, display the HTML below. It's also important to note that if the hold is not for Middlesex Bedford, then nothing will happen. So it won't produce any slip or anything. One final thing to note about this is that template toolkit will go through all of the conditions you give it until it finds a true one, and then it will execute the true condition. And that's going to become more apparent as we go through our actual example. Okay, so here is the real world example that we created in order to do this. And it looks a little more intense, but really it's not using much more than what I've already talked about. So our first section here is for internal holds. So these are holds that are remaining at the Middlesex library. There are 2 Middlesex branches, so I actually have 2 conditions, but I'll get to that in a second. So at the top, we see our template toolkit if statement. It's the same one we saw in the last example. If that condition is true, it's going to print out everything below it. So all of that HTML with the notice slip variables that are available automatically in Koha. We're using some HTML, some mostly heading tags. There are list tags as well. The UL and LI are listed just to create a list. And then finally, down towards the bottom is another statement called an else if statement. It's exactly the same as an if statement, but it just comes after the first if statement. So if that first if statement is false, if this hold is not going to Middlesex Bedford, the next thing we're going to check is if this is going to Middlesex Lowell. That's their other campus library. If that's true, it's then going to print out the HTML below that. So you can see it's going to print out a note that says, use the green slip, send to Lowell. So we're really just using the few tools that we've talked about. And you can see here, we're not even using CSS at all. So all we're using are a couple of conditions from Template Toolkit and a little bit of HTML along with the notice and slip variables that come with Koha automatically. So the second hold slip we needed was a hold slip that identified that this was a ComCat hold. And there's really nothing new here. Where we have yet another else if statement. And remember, an else if statement is exactly the same as an if statement. We're just going to check to see if this condition is true. So if it's going to a ComCat library, print out this HTML below this condition. Again, you can see we're printing out a note that says the item is going out on a ComCat loan, and then the staff member should go into ComCat to complete that loan. And as I mentioned, there's really nothing different here. It's pretty much like what we've seen before. And then finally, this is what produces our formatted slip that is mimicking the statewide delivery system. It looks pretty intense because it's longer, but again, it's really just using HTML and CSS. The most important thing to note here at the top is we are using an else statement. An else statement is basically just the default. So if all of our if and else if statements prior to this did not end up being true, this is the default that will be triggered. And in this example, you can see that we're using tables, like I mentioned before, to format it, and then just some div tags and CSS for more formatting. That's it. A lot of the text is hard-coded into it, so you can see that. And then there are variables that are coming from the Koha notices module as well. And then finally, we end all of this with our final end statement to say that our template is now complete. And that's it. That's how we produced it. There is one final additional piece that I had to use for this project. It may or may not be relevant for you, but it might be something you want to think about. And that is that I utilized address line 3 in the library record itself. So if you look at the image at the bottom, I actually went into each library and set up a region in address line 3, and I just formatted that with some HTML and CSS. And the reason for that was each library is in a different region, and that needed to be generated as part of the slips dynamically. So the easiest way to do that and to format it was just to actually add the HTML directly into that field, and then I just pull it into my notice with one of those Koha provided variables. So it's just the address line 3 variable that's provided by Koha already. And it will, the notice or the slip will recognize the HTML and format it accordingly. Okay, so I'm going to quickly show you, hopefully, how this works. So if you want to see the full template is in our notices and slips here. So you can see everything I've just showed you is just in the normal notices and slips window here under email. You do need to check HTML message. Here are my Koha variables that I can pull in just by clicking insert over here. And as I mentioned, here is my address line 3 variable that I'm pulling in from the library record. So here is our first slip. This should be an internal note or slip. So you click print slip and confirm. Okay, so that is my first slip. I can't make it any bigger. And that is the format that we provided here, and that's for internal use to the library. Let me pull up my second slip. So, oops. My second slip should be going to ComCat. Okay, and there's that note that I asked it to produce for ComCat Holds. And finally, we should have a hold that's going to another HELM library, so an in-network. An in-network slip should be produced. And there we go. So now we've produced something roughly or pretty close to the statewide delivery slip that we needed in order to send these to Holyoke Community College. So as I mentioned, you can see the Western region that is provided in the Holyoke Community College library record. The name as well comes from the school record, and the date finally is just a system provided variable from Koha that you can add to all notices and slips. And then down here, all of this information is hard-coded because it's always going to be coming from this library, the library that I'm working at. Okay, as promised at the beginning, here are a few resources, ones that I found particularly useful as I worked on this project. First up, the Koha Wiki has a couple very useful pages, customizing notices and slips. So if you haven't created your own notices and slips in the past, you're going to want to familiarize yourself with how to do that. And that wiki page will provide you lots of information on doing that. And then there's another really good page on the Koha Wiki, Notices with the Template Toolkit. And that provides a lot of information, including some examples on how to actually put Template Toolkit into your notices. I would say the most important piece of that page is that it provides a table or a chart that shows you all of the variables that are available in each notice. Not every variable is available for each notice, but there are important ones that are in each one. Again, I mentioned the Template Toolkit manual. That is a great resource, although you may only need some basic tools from that, a couple things like I showed you, variables and conditions, maybe all you need. And then if you're interested in good references for HTML and CSS, the W3 Schools has a lot of good information for you. I use it all the time just to look things up. So just using a few things from there, you can easily put together some notices that are formatted. And then finally, if you're interested in learning more about HELM, the Higher Education Libraries of Massachusetts, I provided that link right there. And that concludes my presentation. Thanks for listening. Are there any questions?
Thanks, Joe. That was great. We do have one question from Ed Feel. Is it best practice to put all your CSS inline, or could you point it to a style sheet hosted somewhere else?
That's a good question. I'm not entirely sure of the answer, but I think it has to be inline. That's the only way I've done it before.
Okay. I have a question for you, which is, are you going to be putting this up on the Notices and Slips wiki?
Sure. That's a good idea.
Like 2 weeks ago, I did kind of a similar template toolkit hold slip thing, different for consortium holds and stuff, and just put that up on the wiki as well.
Yeah, I'll add it to the wiki.
And there's lots of great presentation comments. George was going to ask the question I just asked.
And this presentation, I think, will be shared afterwards.
Yeah, we're going to share all the presentations online, and then we also asked for slides. I'm hoping to get slides up today or tomorrow for today's presentations, and tomorrow or Thursday for tomorrow's presentations. So those will all be up on our website. And Ed said in the chat, I think the CSS needs to be inline.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm not entirely sure how it would work if you tried to link to a style sheet.
Okay. Oh, and the Thursday videos that the education committee has been putting together was also about template toolkit notices, similar, like a variation on that. So that's another thing to check out if you're interested in more. Excellent presentation, so many possibilities. And yeah, we're gonna take another break. This one's a little longer. We'll be back at 10:30 my time. Let me look at what all the 10:30 Pacific, 1:30 Eastern for Where Was I Again, making Koha recall user actions after login. And I hope everyone has a nice break.